All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth today for our webinar called Getting on the Grid, Accessing and Using Statistics from the Global Repository of Income Dynamics. My name is Austin Clemens. I'm the Director of Economic Measurement Policy here at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And we're really pleased today to bring you this webinar from work that the center co-funded. And it's going to run about an hour today. We have about 40 minutes of presentations, and then we're going to have some space for questions. I think, we have all three of the principles of this project here today, and so it's a great opportunity to ask some questions and learn about this resource. Please hold questions till the end, but you can ask them at any time using the Q&A box, and then I will at the end moderate some question and answer. All right. So it's a real pleasure today to host three distinguished economists who are the co-directors of the GRID project. Fata and Luigi are here now. Gianluca is going to join us shortly, but let me give quick introductions. So Fata Guvenen is the Curtis L. Carson Professor of Economics at the University of Minnesota and the founding director of the Minnesota Economics Big Data Institute. Luigi is a professor of economics and the Ralph Landau Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And Gianluca Violante, who will be joining us in a little bit, is the Theodore A. Wells 29 Professor of Economics at Princeton University. All three have many other superlatives in their bio, but I'm giving you the short version because we really have three incredible speakers today. I'm going to turn this over to Luigi, who's going to kick us off, and I'll come back at the end for some questions. Please remember to enter those in the Q&A box and include your name and affiliation when you do so. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Luigi.
Thank you, Austin. Thanks for hosting this webinar. Thanks for the support we have received from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth during this period where we have come up with GRID. I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to give you like an overview of what we've been doing. So GRID stands for Global Repository of Income Dynamics, and it's a joint initiative of the three of us, and with very generous funding from our own institution, from Princeton, from Stanford, University of Minnesota, and MEPD. And the goal was to build an open access cross-country database that had these characteristics. It was harmonized database of statistics coming from microdata on two aspects of interest, income inequality and income dynamics. And the source for these statistics come from longitudinal data derived from administrative records, so mostly social security records and tax records for most of the countries that are in GRID. Now, the project has been ongoing for the past 5 years, so it has absorbed a given amount of our time. And we have launched a first phase of GRID, which involves 13 countries. This is the list. It's a combination mostly of North American, some Central and South American countries, plus European countries. And it's been a kind of a collective project in the sense that it has involved 54 economists from these different 13 country teams. And the number of statistics that are available for each country is actually pretty massive. It goes from 500,000 to 1.5 million for many countries. The database, and I'm going to give you a very quick tour at the very end of my presentation, then Fatih is going to take over. The database and the user-friendly website have been recently launched, I think about 6 months ago. And this is the link for those of you who are interested. And again, I'm going to give you a quick tour what you can or cannot do with GRID. Besides the website, another component, another kind of arm of the project was to have this teams to describe the characteristics of their database for their own country, and to also illustrate some peculiar aspects of inequality or aspects of mobility in their own country. And the papers they have produced are now including a special issue of quantitative economics, which is a journal of the Economic Society, came out in November 22, and this is the list of the 13 countries plus an introductory chapter we have written, the three of us, for to illustrate greed. Now, this is now growing. There is a greed 2.0 that is going to take, is going to expand in two directions. The first is to include more countries. We have now expanding greed to about 25 more countries. They will come both from Europe again, but also from Oceania and Asia that are not being represented so far. And we're probably going to have almost all the countries in South America. So it's going to be, for Europe and South America, it's going to be a pretty complete picture. And the goal is to have 40 countries in the database by the summer next year, in 2024. We are also planning to include some features to the website, in particular visualization that is missing right now. So people who want to plot some simple statistics against time for certain demographic groups will be able to do so directly from the website instead of downloading the data and then do the analysis on their own. So that is part of the kind of expansion plan for GRID 2.0. Now, the background, why did we go into this project? Why did we think about having GRID? GRID is not the only database that includes information on income inequality. There are many others. Probably one of the most famous one is the World Inequality Database that was spearheaded by the work of Tony Atkinson, Thomas Piketty, and Emmanuel Saez. You also have other databases like the WIIE2, which is at the United Nations University, and so forth. Now, these cross-country databases have some common features. They are mostly, not exclusively, but mostly based on survey data, not administrative data. They focus mostly on cross-sectional statistics like inequality, and I will discuss what is missed from just having cross-sectional statistics. And most of these databases don't have information on the demographics of the population. Some others do, but they're fairly limited to, for example, things like age and gender, and in kind of very broad categories. So our goal was to extend the focus by introducing GRID, was to extend the focus, first of all, to have as a source data, administrative data rather than survey data. And this was probably impossible to do 20 years ago because administrative data were unavailable for many countries, perhaps with the exception of Scandinavian countries. But now they're actually available for many countries, and many papers in the economic literature are written using this kind of data. We also wanted to extend the focus to the study not only of income inequality or cross-sectional features, but also to income dynamics. So having something to say about mobility across the income distribution for given individuals, or the concept of income instability or volatility or risk or uncertainty, however we want to call it, or the long-run phenomena. And also we wanted to have the opportunity, or we wanted to give people the opportunity to study these concepts for very finely defined subpopulations. And I will give you some example later, rather than either the entire population or very broad categories. Now, the first pillar of GRID is this focus on administrative data. Administrative data relative to survey data, and this is the first thing that distinguishes from the rest, is that the source data are administrative in nature, so Social Security records, tax records, so they tend to have, if income reported accurately, minimal measurement error, and little to no attrition. So basically, no people in administrative data leave the quote-unquote sample unless they die or they migrate. They're always there. So that also gives you the basis of longitudinal information. The size is also important because administrative data typically cover the entire population, a very large chunk of the population. They are available, they can be used to do very granular analysis of subpopulation and also things that happen in the tails of the distribution. And tail events are now been shown to have very important consequences for things like evaluation of welfare or risk premium. And when you look at administrative information on income changes, there are very clear evidence of very high probability of extreme events. It could be, promotions, it could be movements across jobs, it could be demotions, and so forth. That those changes tend to have distributions that are very far from the what we like to have in most economic models. So deviation from normality seems to be the norm rather than the exception. Administrative data in many countries also have these important characteristics that they can be linked. You can have in one database, on one registry or archive, information on income. In other registry, you can have information on health, the characteristics of your employer, and so forth. The only caveat of using administrative data is that in countries where there is a big size of the informal sector, like in the grid, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, and other countries will appear in the second phase of the project, the coverage is limited to formal sector. So what we did to try to remedy to this caveat was asking the teams for this country to provide estimates of the size of the informal sector, or try to see if the findings they were finding for administrative data were also would survive once survey data were taken into account. And this is, I should say, it's ongoing work, because there's definitely a room for improvement of what we're doing. The second aspect of interest, and I think this is really the key part of what we are trying to do with GRID, is that we move beyond cross-sectional information and try to put some emphasis and focus on the dynamics. Cross-sectional data, like most of the database I mentioned before, provide very important features of a distribution, so the degree of inequality or dispersion that exists in incomes, for example, but they are by definition just a static snapshot of what is going on. It misses the dynamics, the fact that you can have two societies that have very similar level of inequality, but in one society there is a lot of reshuffling of the ranks in the distribution, so rich become poor, poor become rich, or you can have two societies that tend to have similar level of inequality, but one is very mobile and the other one instead has very different chances of people moving up or down the distribution. And that, of course, is probably as important as a feature of the distribution to know than the degree of inequality and how inequality evolves over time. In panel data, which is the source of information that is in GRID, coming from the fact that in administrative data, you can follow people over time because you typically tend to pay taxes every year, or you tend to have a job every year, so you are in the Social Security archives. With panel data, you can study income dynamics. You know how income changes from one year to the next, how much asymmetry there is, how persistent incomes are. You can study mobility, whether someone who is at the bottom of the distribution in 1 year will be still at the bottom or will have a chance of moving up over time as he or she ages. And you can also, of course, check whether it is different for men and women, whether this is different across countries, etc. You can study tail behavior. What is the chance of getting very high realization or very low realization of your income? And this is related to the phenomenon of probability of wage cuts versus wage hikes, and how they differ, for example, over business cycles. The heterogeneity component is important. So the fact that you can study this phenomenon not only for the whole population, but also separately by groups, because in the economic literature, we know that income risk, income inequality, mobility patterns vary very significantly by, for example, cohorts, so defined by birth year. They vary significantly by gender, by education, by the type of employer people have, and the work horizon cherry, for example, also shows that they vary significantly by the geographical location in which individual lives. In GREED, a lot of the statistics that we have are reported for very narrow groups defined by the interaction of gender, year birth, age group, and permanent income. And permanent income, again, this is importance of panel data, is defined as the 3-year average income. So you cannot construct this average, of course, if you don't have repeated observations on individual, and again, the source of the data allows people to do that. And this is actually defined in 40 quantiles beans, plus we have more granularity at the very top, just to put the emphasis on top shares, for example. Now, the list of statistics that you will find in GREED is being inspired by recent empirical and theoretical work. So a lot of the emphasis on providing flexible quantile-based statistics, so people have the liberty and have the freedom to construct an indicator of choice. So besides the standard, top shares, the Gini coefficient, the standard deviation P9010, you also have essentially all the percentile of the distribution. So you can, if you're interested in 90-50 percentile difference, or in the difference in the interquartile range or something like that, that's something you can do. You can do the same for measures of volatility or for measures of skewness. So there are moments related to skewness and asymmetry and the kurtosis of a distribution. So if you're interested in the fatness of the tail or the probability of large extreme events, that's something you can measure and do with GREED. And the statistics that you will find in the database, and again, I'm going to give you a very brief tour, are available for 4 different income measures. If this was the US, it would be available for income in dollar terms, in logs, residualizing after taking out common effects coming from time and age, and a measure of permanent income, which, as I said, is this average income for each individual computed over the previous 3 years. And this is an overview of the variables that you will find. So there are information on income levels, there's information on the dynamics on income changes. So there are measures of inequality for annual and for permanent income. And one unique feature is that there is actually information on the empirical densities. So we take the distribution of income in 1 year, we divide the distribution in 400 equally sized interval, and we report for each one of these interval, which accounts for 0.25%. For each one of these, we compute the density associated with that bean. So you will know, how fat the tails are, whether the distribution is symmetrical. So you can really plot the entire distribution of income in a given year for a given country, and also for different demographic groups. The information you will find on income changes, if you're interested again in the dynamics of income rather than the cross-sectional snapshot, are changes over 1 or 5 year period. And this is important for those who think that there are persistent changes in income that are more welfare relevant than transitory changes, or for people who want to study both. We report both log change and arc percent change. The arc percent change is a measure that allows to account for the zeros, so for periods in activity or for periods in which people are not working. There are information about short-run and long-run mobility statistics, so we can see what's the probability that individual in a given percentile of the distribution moves up over 1 year or a 5 year period. And these are all available for very finely defined groups. So one example is you could find the Gini coefficient for Canadian women of age 30 in 2005. And you change the country, the gender, the age, and the year, and you can, for these 13 countries and for these many years, get all this information that you want. I want to give you a quick tour of what you can find in our website. So there are 2 types of information you can get: time series, or by skill, where skill is the measure of permanent income I mentioned before. So it's information for these 13 countries. Actually, UK is coming soon. The type of statistics are, you can choose from this very vast menu. So if you were interested in income inequality, you could find information on the shares, the top shares and the Gini, the Pareto tail. And then for each of the measures of income you are interested in, log income, residualized, etc., you can find moments, you can find lots of percentiles, and so forth. And then you have for the permanent income. And then, you can expand it to be, instead of inequality, you could find, for example, the empirical density. So the midpoint of these 400 beans plus the density. For mobility, you will be able to find the average percentile each individual will happen to be 1 year, 5 years after we record the percentile is currently in, and so forth. So, and then the subpopulation allow you to go, by gender or by each specific age. So again, this is the Canadian women of age 30. It would be you would be able to get information about this. Okay. The harmonization has been a key focus from the beginning. We both try to, have a common income definition, similar time periods, and same sample selection. But for countries that will join, the most interesting thing is that we use a single master code to generate all statistics. So people get this master code when they join the project. They apply it on their raw data, and then they just run the file, and we get the statistics back, and we put it on the website. And I think I'm gonna now pass the baton to Fatih.
Okay, thank you, Luigi, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to follow up to Luigi's presentation with giving some examples of how grid can be used. Without delving into the details of each example, I want to give you like a helicopter tour over the different variables that are available, over the different cuts of data that you can look at. So I'm going to start with inequality. And it's a question that is everywhere, as you know. And I want to ask the following question. Is income inequality rising globally? And if you listen to the debate about inequality, there's a narrative out there that inequality is a global phenomenon and it's rising in every country. So what we can do with grid, for each country, we can calculate over the sample period that we observe a country. And that varies. We have some countries like the US that we observe for 20 years. We have other countries like, Brazil and Italy, for example, that we observe for almost 35 years. So we take each sample period for each country, and then we calculate how much has inequality changed from the first year to the last year of the sample. And we are going to annualize that to make it comparable across countries. And I'm going to look at how different countries' inequality changed over this period, and we get a picture like this. So if you look at the axis, to give you an idea, this number 2 is 2% per year. Now, if you take a quick look here, we don't see all countries' inequality rising. In fact, we see a very different picture. These countries in the middle, there's about 7 of them. If you look at the y-axis, this is a roughly 0.2% increase per year. Now, if you look at the overall level of this measure of inequality, which is P9010, it's about 150 log points. So over a 10-year horizon, you are going to get a 2%, 3% increase in the P9010, which is really like a rounding error. It's a very small number. So I will conclude from this tentatively that for about half of the countries, inequality has been pretty stable. Now, inequality did rise for Germany, for Italy, and for Spain by sizable amounts. Although for Spain, we need to be careful because the data period we have overlaps with the Great Recession and with the sovereign default crisis. So when you look at the inequality picture, actually it goes up and then comes down by the end of the the period. But nevertheless, inequality rises by non-negligible amounts. Now, if you turn to the bottom end, in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, especially in the first two, inequality has declined substantially during this period. So if you want to summarize this figure, I would say we do not see really a global increase in inequality. The picture is much more nuanced, with about half of the countries have stable inequality, a quarter having a decline, and a quarter having an increase in inequality. And as you can see, these are pretty, broad set of countries, geographically and economically, and so on. So I'll turn from
Recording in progress.
Was there a question? Okay. So I'm hearing an echo. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but I'll continue. So I'm going to move to another question, which is, again, gets a lot of attention. How much does income on average rise over the life cycle? Right? We all look forward to the future because, incomes keep growing on average. And how does this look in different countries? Now, I'm not going to do it for 12 countries. It will be too much in one figure. So I'm going to do for USA, France, Mexico, and Sweden. And I'm normalizing the income in year one, at age 25 to 1. And as you can see here, income rises in the US by about 130%. In France, it rises by about 90%. In Mexico, about 60%, and in Sweden, about 60%. Now, you can look at this figure and actually test a number of hypotheses. So, for example, one hypothesis that have been proposed for these different rates of growth of income is human capital accumulation. That in developed countries like the USA and France, there is more human capital accumulation, which creates a steeper profile of income over the life cycle. And in Mexico, you get less of that because there's less human capital accumulation. So how about Sweden? But there's another hypothesis that actually, because income tax is much more progressive in Sweden, that hampers human capital accumulation. Again, you have a flatter income profile over the life cycle. So whatever your theory, whatever your thesis is, you can use data here, and you're not restricted to the mean. You can do this for the median. You can do it for pretty much any percentile, and you are able to do that because these statistics are available at every age, not like broad age groups. So let's turn to another dimension of inequality: women and their representation in the top end of the income distribution. And let's look at what fraction of top earners are women. And how has that changed over time? So I'm going to do this again for the same 4 countries. And when you take a broad look at this, you see both good news and bad news. The good news is that the share of women in the top 1%, for example, and the same for top 0.1%, has been increasing continuously during this period. The bad news is the level is still very low. Now, if you look at the top 0.1%, you see a similar picture, but at the same time, for the United States, you see a more mixed picture, where you don't really see a big increase after the 2000s in women's representation at the top. Another interesting observation is that Norway typically has a lower gender gap than some other countries. It's not known for a country to be very high gender gap. Yet, when you go to the very top of the distribution, which we can do basically because the data is not top coded for most countries, you see that the representation of women is actually lower than other countries. So these are just a few examples to hopefully whet your appetite that what you can do, what's available out there, and about inequality. But like I said, and Luigi also mentioned, a major advantage of GRID is that it's based on panel data. And because it's based on panel data, you can look at the dynamics of income. So let me start with a question that has been extensively studied in economics. and that is whether income instability has increased over time. And the question, as you know, I think it's familiar to everyone. It's very important for many questions and for policy design. Now, this literature starts with a seminal paper by Moffitt and Gottschalk, who found that income volatility increased substantially between 1968 and 1988 in survey data. And about 30 plus papers, subsequent papers, have confirmed this result. And then they extended it all the way to 2010s. So let me show you how the picture looks like. This is, for example, the variance of 2-year income growth. And if you look at the overall picture, you see almost like a trend increase over this 40-year period. And if you look at the magnitudes, the variance has almost tripled during this time. So this is what we see from survey data. So now it has become conventional wisdom. You know, there are books written on this. There's, you know, you can find lots of quotes by anyone. We taught this for many years, actually, in our macro labor classes. And now, if you look at administrative data, you see a similar picture. So if you go prior to grid, you know, if you look at the US, same fact, but administrative data, you get a very different picture. You actually find that the income volatility has been on a declining trend in the last 40 years. So this data set that I show you ends, this is from the Social Security Administration data, and it ends around 2012. The US team for grid, they have generated all the statistics like other countries, so we can look at the same statistic for the 1998 to 2018-19 period. And I'm plotting it here for both men and women, and as you can see, both of them actually continue to trend downward. So that begs the question, how about the rest of the world? We can look at all countries, all 12 countries that is not the US. And again, if you just take a broad, you know, look, I'm not going to talk about every single country here, but you don't see basically any country in which the variance is doubling or tripling or show like a strong upward trend. In fact, in Argentina and Brazil, it's declining, whereas in other countries like Canada, Denmark, you know, France, Germany, and many others, it is flat. You don't see a change. Now, you see an increase if you look at Italy, and if you look at the blue squares, which is men. So for men, there's some increase in Italy, and in Norway, there's some increase for men again in Norway. In Spain, you do see an increase for men, but like I said, this is mostly the Great Recession and the sovereign debt crisis. By the end of the period, you go back to where you started. So just to summarize, income volatility has been declining in several countries. It's been flat in even more countries, about 7 or 8 of them, and it's increasing only in a few, like for men in Italy and Norway and women in the UK before the 1990s. So we do not see any broad-based increase that will justify there's more uncertainty or there's more instability as suggested by the US survey data. So this is one advantage of grid, that, you know, you have a question you are interested in and you can quickly and easily go and look at how it looks in the entire global economy. Now I'm going to move from income volatility over time to how income volatility varies by income level. And I'm going to do this again for the US. This is a picture that requires some explanation how we form it. It's a dynamic picture. So what we do is we rank people what we call permanent income. It's a proxy for permanent income. The way it's constructed is you follow individuals over time, and for each individual, you calculate their average income over a period of 3 years or 5 years. Then you rank people, as you can see, into quantiles by this average measure. We view this as some measure of skill or some measure of long-run economic status. Then within each percentile group that you formed, you look how income growth variance changes, okay, for that group. Okay, so the graph that you get is something like this. You know, at low income levels, income volatility is very high. As income grows, or at higher levels, income volatility declines monotonically. What is perhaps surprising is that this changes at the very top of the distribution. When you look at the top 1%, in fact, the volatility of their income is higher than anywhere else in the distribution. And this has been documented for the US and created some surprise, because is that really true? Do you really have more volatility, or is there something going on? We can now look at, again, all the countries in the sample. Again, I'm going to show you 12 countries. Now, keep in mind that the y-axis has been normalized across countries, so the graphs are a bit, squeezed. But the decline is very similar. If you look at Argentina, let's put Brazil aside for a moment, but Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, in almost every country, the picture is very similar to the US. Moreover, this spike that you see at the top, again, with the exception of Brazil, Italy, and Mexico, which I will talk about in just a second, you see the same spike in Canada, in Denmark, in France, in Germany. And these are countries where, the top income inequality sometimes is lower than the US. But interestingly, it turns out that income volatility for top earners seems to be really high in all of these countries. The reason why we see a different picture in Brazil, Italy, and Mexico is that these countries have top coding, but the top coding is actually very high. I think in Brazil, it is 120 times the minimum wage. So it's a really high level, but this picture pushes the limit, so to speak, because you split the sample into age groups, then into 40 income groups, 100, because we're looking at the very top. So for that group, that turns out to be, it seems binding a little bit. But overall, again, you take a fact and you want to know, is it robust across countries? Do we see interesting variation across countries? And you can do that easily. I'm going to now turn to the last fact I want to discuss, which is the Great Gatsby curve. And as you know, the Great Gatsby curve is this empirical relationship between the level of income inequality in a country and the level of income mobility across generations. And the idea is that empirically what you see in countries where income inequality is higher, income mobility is lower. So we don't have intergenerational links yet in GRID, but we are going to ask a similar question over the life cycle. So we are going to say, are countries where income inequality higher also countries in which income mobility over the life cycle is lower? And you get a picture like this. So the y-axis is the rank correlation of income. The higher it is, the less mobility there is. And the x-axis is the Gini coefficient. You can do this with other measures. You get very similar figures, basically. And maybe with some outliers like Italy and France, the rest of the countries align nicely in an upward sloping shape. So it seems like there is some sort of a Great Gatsby curve also within the life cycle of individuals, not only across generations. So I'm going to conclude. I hope you found these examples useful. There's a lot more in the database that we can cover in like a webinar or any talk like this. So I strongly encourage you to go and dig into it. And I'm sure you will find some interesting patterns that are buried among like the millions of statistics for all these countries. So to conclude, GRID is an open access cross-country database of statistics in income inequality and income dynamics. And that part is very important and unique to GRID. GRID version 2.0 will triple the number of countries in the database. As Luigi showed, it expands not only more in Europe, will pretty much cover the entire Europe, Latin America, and will add many countries in Asia. And we have future plans to expand the set of variables included in GRID. And one area we have in mind is to look at the worker-firm connections, because in many countries, the data sets that we have a matched employer-employee component. But that is coming maybe in GRID 3.0. So we welcome all feedback and suggestions. So drop us a line at support@grid-database.org. And please follow us on Twitter for future updates. This is the official basically way that if there's a change, there's an update, this is where we communicate. and it's at GRID database. And I would like to again thank the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for giving us this opportunity to talk about GRID. And thank you all for coming.
Great, thanks so much, Fateh. I'll invite Luigi and Gianluca to come on camera and we can answer some questions. Let me just start, actually. I'll encourage people either in the Q&A or the chat, please leave your questions and also affiliations if you can. Let me just start. I wanted to mention y'all had a special journal issue of quantitative economics with articles from, I believe, all 13 of your country teams. And I'm wondering if you can just briefly give us, maybe spotlight some findings from the US or other countries that were interesting or surprising to you, to give our attendees some idea of what kinds of research people are already doing using these data.
Yes, maybe Gianluca starts. Yeah, Gianluca.
Oh yeah, okay. No, I'm going to start with two examples that I found. First of all, hello everybody. Sorry I was late. I couldn't make it earlier today. Maybe two examples that I found especially interesting, which are findings for Italy. In fact, Luigi was one of the co-authors of the Italy paper, and in Argentina. So the way the special issue is organized is the following. We asked each country team to split the article in two parts. In the first part, there is essentially a common structure where every team has reported statistics of the type that Fari talked about in a common format, so they're comparable across teams, and basically figure and tables are very comparable. And in the second part of the papers, we basically let team roam freely and come up with one feature that they thought it was especially interesting about the country that they studied, they developed basically the second part of the paper based on that. So maybe I'm going to talk about maybe two things, and then I'll let Luigi talk about the Italy finding, which is he's the author. So the first one that I thought was really interesting is Argentina. So Argentina, what the Argentina team did, they looked at the degree of wage stickiness, nominal wage rigidity, right? We know how nominal wage rigidity important it is in macroeconomics, because it's one of the main sources of the effect of real effects of monetary policy. The extent to which aggregate shocks amplify to the rest of the economy has a lot to do with the to a large extent determined by the degree of wage and price rigidity. And the Argentinian team, they put together some statistics about the extent of nominal wage rigidity and different phases of the economic history of Argentina over the past, I think, 20 or 30 years, where the level of inflation was very different, right? We know that Argentina had some periods of low inflation, some periods of high inflation, some periods of very, very high inflation, hyperinflation. And one of their major findings, which it kind of makes a lot of sense, I think, and it's important for macroeconomics, is that the degree of wage stickiness varies a lot with the level of inflation. Meaning that if you take the share of workers whose nominal wage doesn't change from a year to the next, that's very high in periods of low inflation. But as inflation starts to increase, say above like 10% per year, then the share of workers with no change in the nominal wage shrinks enormously. So this tells us basically that there is a level of inflation essentially above which there is very frequent renegotiation, of nominal wages, and nominal wages become to be indexed very, very closely to inflation, which, as we know, can actually lead to wage price spirals that amplify inflation itself. I think this is very relevant for today's macroeconomy, in particular. This idea that for low levels of inflation, maybe these wage price spirals are not really a big issue, but as the level of inflation starts growing, then it can become a real concern. And there is a beautiful picture in the Argentina's paper that shows this very clearly. Very briefly, some of the countries in our special issue are countries from Latin America, where the issue of informality is really important, right? And the administrative data, I'm not sure this is something that Fatih and Fatih talked about, Luigi talked about. They did okay. So the issue of informality is really important, and there is a big share of informal workers. And the administrative data, they only cover the formal labor market. So these countries like Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, they did really a big effort in trying to combine together survey data, where you can actually have a fairly good sense of the extent to which informality matters for individuals and workers, and wages and earnings and so on, with the administrative data. So they basically combined data sources in order to get a fuller picture of the dynamics of the income distribution. And that's a really important addition, because the administrative data alone obviously would not give a full picture of the wage distribution or the income distribution. And I'll let Luigi talk about the.
Yeah, I can add, for example, I mean, the topical part of each paper, it was kind of country specific, like in the US. John About and his co-author looked at earnings differential by race and gender in different parts of the income distribution. So, we always have information about average differentials, but we don't know if these differentials are larger actually at the bottom or at the top, or they differ significantly across, Asian men versus Asian women relative to whites, and so on and so forth. That was the contribution. In Italy, we studied whether the wave of labor market reforms that started in the 90s is actually responsible for some of the trends that we see in inequality and in volatility. In the case of France, they studied, for example, how different parts of France evolved in terms of inequality and mobility. In Sweden, I think, if I remember correctly, they looked at the experience of immigrants versus native born, given that now the immigrant population in Sweden is very significant. I think it's more than 15% of the whole population, and so forth. This is just to give you a sense of how people use the data at their disposal to highlight some specific issues, or try to answer some specific question that are very, very relevant for their country.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a few questions coming in now, so I'll try to get to some of these. Again, feel free to leave more questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So let me start with a couple of data questions, and I'll just kind of package these together. So Jonathan Fisher asks if you have intergenerational mobility currently or plans to add it. And then Victor Chin asks, if I understand correctly, the only demographic variables included now are age and gender. Is it possible to include other demographic variables in future releases?
Fatih.
I can answer the intergenerational. So at the moment, we don't have statistics on intergenerational mobility, but this is feasible for many countries. For many countries, it's feasible. For many, for example, Scandinavian countries, it's very easy to construct intergenerational links. For others, like Italy, is a little bit more challenging. For the US, kind of it depends on the data source, but it's definitely on the horizon. It's something that we think it's a priority, and it would be really, I think, an important addition. And so we're definitely going to work on it. And as I said, I mean, for some countries, we could include it probably in the next edition of the, in the next revision of the data. For others, it will be more work, but we're certainly going in that direction. Absolutely. It's feasible for most countries, probably.
In terms of, maybe I can add one thing. In terms of additional variables, one thing I want to point out is we have age, gender, but there's another variable that we call skill, and that's the permanent income measure that we defined. We found that to be a very good proxy, actually, for a number of characteristics like education in the past research. And that is the most detailed component of all the data that we have out there. So let me just make that clear. But in terms of additional data variables to add, in version 1.0, we focused on variables that are available in every country. So we want it to be like, homogeneous as much as possible. That made it easier. And, however, for example, for many countries, we have education, and we can generate these variables by education. And that is on our list, hopefully in grid, I don't know, version 3.0, but we are aware that actually there is very valuable information that's out there that we have access to, and we plan to add them when we can.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add that, if you have year and age, you also have the year of birth, so you can follow cohort. And we also have, for many countries, occupation. So the distinction between blue collar, white collar, or executive, this is actually available in many countries. So we chose for the, as Fat is saying, to just focus on variables that we could have for all countries. But all the things that we discussed are not available for all countries. So we're going to have data sets that are going to be a little bit lopsided. So some cells, when it comes to education, are going to be empty for some countries and available for other countries in phase 2.0. And same is going to be for the intergenerational. So there's simply some restriction on data availability at the administrative level, which would mean that, intergeneration would be fine, totally fine, and available for most Scandinavian countries, but very hard to get for, I don't know, Mexico, for example, because just the sources are not linkable across generations.
Great. There's clearly a lot of demand for more data. So I think this is a good sign for you all. I'm going to try to somewhat focus on questions about the data, since I think that's what we want to focus on in this webinar. But I'll invite you all to also respond to questions in the chat if we don't quite get to them. I know David Johnson here has a question about how your results maybe don't quite look like Robert Moffat's using LEHD on intergenerational, or I'm sorry, on earnings volatility. Let me ask a couple more little data questions here. So Margarita Lopez Ferrero asks, related to Fatih's presentation, for the higher volatility at top incomes, do you have an idea of the extent to which tax avoidance in offshore centers contributes to this?
The first one was taxable income, or?
For the higher volatility you showed at top incomes, is that maybe related to tax avoidance?
So this is mostly labor income. I would expect it to be, and this is W2, like wage and salary income. I think there was another question about income definition. And right. Luigi talked about harmonization, and that's an area we spent a lot of time before we started doing any work to try to understand what is the most common definition across countries so we can make them comparable. And that is wage and salary income, and it includes, overtime pay, tips, bonuses and things of that sort. In many countries, stock options, for example, are considered labor income because they are remuneration for your labor, work. So it is in there. But I would imagine if we were to look at capital income, that would probably be much more important than just labor income that we are looking at. I don't know if Luigi or Gianluca has any comments.
No.
This question about income concepts also asked if you plan to offer other income concepts in the future. I don't know if you all want to respond to that.
So we have different definitions of income, just on the basis of whether they are residualized or they try to take out common age effects or time effects. But we don't have, I think, the implicit question is whether we have, I don't know, information about income from self-employment and income from employed labor. I think it would be relatively easy to construct a measure of, before taxes and after tax, if one were to import information about the tax brackets and the rates, at least on a very kind of broad and gross manner. So right now the plan is not to add extra measures of income, but if the feedback we get from potential users that this is something that people really value, then we could certainly revisit. And one of the reasons why we want to have this webinar is precisely to get a pulse of what people really want and what people really think that the project should try to cover.
Yeah, maybe I can add that the source of the administrative source of our data varies. So for some countries, it's Social Security data, and then if that is the source, obviously, almost by definition, we don't have any information on capital income. Other sources are tax records, and from tax records, we could obtain data on capital income potentially. So for some countries, this is definitely feasible. So if there is, if we keep hearing this question, as Luigi says, I think if there is demand, for some countries, we can certainly construct measures of capital income, self-employment income, business income, and so on.
And one more question along those same lines, which I quite like. Actually, this is also from Margarita Lopez Ferrer. She's asking, the French paper exploits some regional inequality. Do you have plans to include regional dimensions in the data?
So I think this is one of the issues in which, how we can compare countries is at the core, because, what is a regional dimension in the United States is Midwest, Center, South, West, etc. What is the meaning in Italy? There's no West and East, there's South and North. So we can certainly, think of a creative way of presenting the data with a regional dimension, but it will be different across countries. In the same way that, ethnicity makes sense in a place like the US, probably doesn't make sense in a very homogeneous country. Well, now all countries are, becoming very heterogeneous. But the answer is this data actually are available. The geographical dimension is actually available in the vast majority of the 13 countries. So this is definitely something that we can include very quickly and with very limited effort. The issue we had when we thought about this was, okay, how are we going to actually introduce the regional dimension where it means different things in different places? France is Paris versus everything else, but there is no such a thing like in a country like the United States. But it's a great question. It's a great point. Yes, the answer is we're going to do it. We just have to find a way for it to make a sense. So you probably have to be country specific.
California and everything else, just the same in the US.
Indeed. Actually, Northern California and Southern.
That's right. That's right. So we're almost having to wrap up. Let me end with, so Akash Bhatt at UMass Amherst had a couple of questions here, but I want to, just since we're limited on time, I think his most important one is, says this project is fascinating. How can someone get involved, work with y'all on this? Maybe we'll have that as our last question.
So if you go to our website, we actually have at the bottom, we have a link about, it says get involved, and you can send a message to us. And we are always looking for, people who have the energy and enthusiasm and who are willing to contribute. So I encourage you to go to the website. You will see the link to send a message to us.
And we're always looking for funding, so I can put my checking account number on it. No, but more seriously, this is a project that has relied so far on the funding of our own institutions. We are probably going to get some funding from NSF to continue with phase 2, but any type of collaboration, yes, there is a part on the website where you can include your name, and yes, we're always looking for people to expand this project. It's something that we do for the general public. It's an open source, so to speak. So it's good to see that there is some interest in it and that people are planning to use it.
Great. I think we'll end there. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. Thanks so much, Fateh, Gianluca, and Luigi for presenting. If people have more questions, maybe y'all can contact them directly. I know David Johnson probably wants this answer, so I'll leave him to follow up with you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Austin.
For joining us today. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Everybody. Thank you. Bye.